The beginning of the impossible. Henry Tanner was no stranger to isolation. He had lived alone in the remote corners of space for 6 long years, working as the chief engineer on the deep space mining rig, number 47, nicknamed the Headache, by its crew for the constant maintenance issues. It was a piece of floating metal, a relic of a company that had cut costs on everything, from crew members to equipment. But for Henry, it was home. The endless expanse of the asteroid belt surrounding him, the dark void of space. These were his constant companions. And in the silence he found peace. Or at least, that's how he saw it. At 42, Henry had grown used to the night shifts, the quiet hum of the rig's machinery, and the familiar monotony. He was a man who had learned to live with the constant undercurrent of anxiety, ever present, since his childhood. The doctors had given it a name, generalized anxiety disorder, but Henry knew it as something far more personal. It was a companion he had learned to navigate through, even when it seemed to cripple others. He had no use for therapy or medication beyond the essentials. A cigarette, some pills, and the soothing hum of machines were enough to get him through the days, or the nights as it was. This night, however, something felt different. Henry sat alone in the control room, his cigarette hanging loosely between his fingers, the tip glowing softly in the darkness. A dog-eared fishing magazine lay open in front of him, the pages yellowed and frayed at the edges. It had been his constant companion during long shifts, a relic from his first days on the rig, and though he'd read it hundreds of times, he found some comfort in its familiarity. There was nothing new to see, no excitement to be had, just the same old advertisements and fishing tips. The rig's artificial intelligence system periodically chimed in with reminders, most of which Henry ignored. They were always the same, like the reminders to check the drill bit's temperature or the CO2 scrubbers, the humdrum of life on the Headache. Reminder: smoking is prohibited in all areas of deep space mining rig 47, the AI's sweet, non-threatening voice reminded him. Henry glanced at the blinking console, the AI's message appearing on the screen. "Without your capacitor," he muttered, taking another drag from his cigarette. It was the 3rd time the AI had reminded him about the no-smoking rule tonight. He didn't care. In this tiny control room, in the middle of nowhere, rules felt distant and irrelevant. The flicker of maintenance alerts on his console caught his attention. 3 different problems were demanding his attention. The drill bit was overheating again, the scrubbers were malfunctioning, and the recycling system needed a filter change. Henry knew exactly what to do. Nothing. Not now. He was alone, and the other 6 crew members were all fast asleep in the crew quarters, completely unaware of the problems piling up around them. To Henry, it didn't matter. His world was quiet, and for now it was enough. "Screw them all," Henry muttered under his breath, leaning back in his chair. The sound of the station's systems, the hum of the life support, the occasional click of relays, was all he needed to feel grounded. It was in the quiet of the night, in the routine of his isolation, that he felt at peace. No one was demanding anything from him. He could smoke his cigarette, read his magazine, and forget about the world. Reminder: all maintenance alerts require immediate attention according to Extra Helios Mining Corporation protocols. The AI chirped again, its voice still overly polite and cheerful. Reminder: go to hell, Henry snapped, not bothering to look at the console. There was no response this time. The AI, which was built to avoid confrontation, stayed silent. He rubbed absently at his chest, feeling the familiar tightness settle there. It was as if someone had wrapped their hand around his rib cage and squeezed just enough to make him uncomfortable. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small plastic bottle. The orange label faded with age. It read, Alum Henry Tea. Take as needed for anxiety. Henry shook the bottle and popped a pill into his palm, swallowing it dry. There was no water, no fanfare, just the pill, the familiar ritual, and the slow burn of the medication working its way into his system. Anxiety had been his constant companion since he was a boy, back when he watched his father's refinery explode from the playground at East Houston Elementary. He'd always been told that it was a condition, a disorder, but for Henry it was just part of who he was. The pills helped, the cigarettes helped, and the isolation of space, far away from the chaos of Earth, helped. The rig had become his sanctuary, a place where he could breathe, if only for a moment, without the weight of the world pushing him down. There was no pressure here, no deadlines to meet, no bills to pay. The only thing he had to worry about was the state of the machinery around him, and even then it wasn't urgent. Henry had seen it all. Malfunctions, breakdowns, systems failing, he knew how to fix them. Eventually, the flickering of his console snapped him out of his reverie. A proximity alarm sounded, a shrill, insistent noise that Henry had heard only twice in 6 years. Once during a meteor shower and once when corporate had come for a surprise inspection. Neither situation had been particularly pleasant, but this one felt different. This wasn't just a glitch or a false alarm. Henry could feel it in his gut. Approaching vessel detected, the AI announced. Its voice, usually so cheery, was now slightly more urgent. Unable to identify configuration. No transponder signal detected. No response to automated hails. Henry's heart rate picked up. Pirates, he muttered under his breath, glancing at the screen. It could be anything. Corporate, pirates, or just some stray piece of debris. But something in the back of his mind told him this wasn't ordinary. He grabbed his toolkit, a heavy metal box filled with wrenches, diagnostic tools, and a few makeshift weapons in case things went sideways. If there was anything that could be done about this, it would start with him. The captain was useless, and the rest of the crew was asleep. Henry was the only one who cared enough to look into it. Making his way through the station's corridors, he could feel the tension mounting. The silence of the night had been shattered. This wasn't just another day on the job. Something was coming. And whatever it wasn't good. As he reached the observation deck, Henry's pulse quickened. What he saw outside the reinforced glass didn't match anything he'd ever seen. It wasn't a ship, not in the traditional sense. It was more like a cloud, a swirling mass of vapor against the backdrop of stars. It shifted in unnatural ways, expanding and contracting like it was breathing. Now that's peculiar, Henry muttered, a sense of unease creeping over him. He reached for the emergency alert panel but stopped before his fingers could touch. The lights flickered and died, plunging the rig into darkness. For 3 long heartbeats there was nothing but the sound of his own breathing, quickening with the sudden tension. Then the emergency lights kicked in, casting everything in an eerie red glow. Gravity fluctuations detected, the AI intoned, its voice now robotic and distant. Henry's stomach lurched as the rig's gravity wavered for a moment, disorienting him. He gripped the railing to steady himself. Something was wrong. Very wrong. "Stat report," Henry barked, but the AI didn't respond. The emergency systems were running on minimal power. Life support, gravity, basic illumination. Everything else had been sacrificed to keep the essentials going. Pulling his handheld radio from his belt, he tried calling out to the crew. "This is Tanner, anybody copy?" But all he received was static. There was no answer. "Great," Henry muttered. He shoved the radio back into its holster. The crew wasn't awake. He'd have to deal with this himself. With a heavy sigh, he grabbed his toolkit and started heading for the crew quarters. It wasn't just the silence that felt off now. The darkness pressed in on him, heavier than before, like it had intention, like it was watching him. Something was happening on this rig, and whatever it wasn't going to let him ignore it. The shadowy mist continued to seep from the ventilation grates above him, twisting into shapes that seemed to be waiting for him, ready to strike. The control room, the AI, and the maintenance. Problems. All of it felt distant now, secondary to the overwhelming sense that whatever was out there had been waiting for this moment. It was no longer a mining rig. It was a trap. The first encounter, Henry's boots echoed in the empty corridors of the rig. The sound unnervingly loud in the eerie silence that had fallen over the station. Each step felt like it was taking him deeper into the unknown, further away from the comfortable monotony of his isolated life. The rig's dim emergency lighting cast long shadows, twisting the walls into grotesque shapes that seemed to stretch and writhe, as though they had a life of their own. Henry didn't stop. He kept moving forward, his mind focused on the mission at hand. Investigate the mysterious vessel that had appeared out of nowhere. Possibly a threat. Possibly an unknown force that would alter everything. As he reached the crew quarters, he slowed his pace. The door to the hallway opened with a soft hiss, revealing the dimly lit room beyond. It was strange, the sense of abandonment in the air. The crew, normally spread throughout the station, were nowhere to be found. Their personal items were scattered about, books, clothes, half-empty mugs, but no one was there. It was as if they had vanished in the blink of an eye. His chest tightened as he stepped further into the room, his eyes scanning the empty bunks. The stillness of it all felt wrong, out of place. He reached for the intercom panel but hesitated. Something was off. This wasn't just another maintenance failure or a glitch. No, this was something he couldn't explain. A knot of unease formed in his stomach. Suddenly a faint, almost imperceptible sound filled the room, a rustling in the air like the fluttering of unseen wings. Henry froze, his senses sharpening. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he searched for the source of the noise. That's when he saw it, a thin, pale mist seeping from the vents in the ceiling. It was like smoke, but not. It moved in odd patterns, curling and twisting, almost like it had purpose. The mist spread across the room in slow, deliberate movements, as if it were aware of him. Henry instinctively took a step back, but his curiosity kept him rooted in place. This wasn't just any fog, it was something more, something alien. His mind raced with possibilities. Was this a contamination? Some sort of chemical leak? No, this wasn't like anything he had encountered in his years. Working on deep space rigs, the mist seemed too controlled, too purposeful. And there was something else. Something unsettling in the way it moved, as if it were alive. He reached for his toolkit, the weight of it comforting in his hands. The metallic clank of the tools, shifting inside the box, echoed through the room, but the mist didn't react. Instead, it continued to swirl around him, coalescing into a shape. At first it was formless, an indistinct mass, but then slowly it took form, becoming taller, more defined. Henry's pulse quickened. This wasn't a simple mist. This was a being, a creature, and it was standing right in front of him. The creature's form rippled in the air, shifting and undulating like liquid smoke. It was humanoid in shape but distorted, the edges of its limbs and torso fading into the mist, making it difficult to focus on. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were nothing more than shifting voids, pits of darkness that seemed to absorb the light around them. Henry swallowed hard, his body instinctively tense. His mind screamed at him to run, but he stood frozen in place. Then, without warning, the creature moved. It extended what could only be described as an arm toward him. It wasn't a hand, more like a vaporous tendril that reached out slowly, deliberately, as if to touch him. And then, in a blur of motion, it released a cloud of thick, sickly green vapor directly into Henry's face. The mist stung as it hit his nostrils, the sharp chemical smell assaulting his senses. He inhaled involuntarily, bracing for the typical rush of panic that always followed exposure to anything out of the ordinary. But instead of the suffocating fear he expected, something strange happened. A sense of calm washed over him. His heartbeat, which had been pounding in his chest, slowed to a steady rhythm. The tightness in his chest, something he had lived with his entire life, began to ease. "Smells like home," Henry muttered with a dry laugh, though there was no humor in his voice. It wasn't fear that the gas had triggered in him. It was something else. The scent of petroleum, sulfur, the acrid tang of refinery emissions, all mixing together in a way that took him back to his childhood in Houston. The smell of home. The creature, which had been moving closer, seemed to pause. Henry could almost sense its confusion. Though its misty form had no discernible facial expression, the alien seemed to recoil, its form shifting in ways that suggested hesitation. Henry took a deliberate, deep breath, savoring the scent as if he were testing wine. Got notes of benzene, a bit of sulfur dioxide, with a subtle finish of ethylene oxide, he commented as though he were discussing an expensive bottle of whiskey. Hell, smells better than the refinery back home on a hot, humid day. The mist being flickered, its form rippling in what Henry interpreted as uncertainty. The alien creature tried again, releasing another burst of the green vapor, this time more concentrated, more potent. But Henry didn't flinch. Instead, he inhaled again, the familiar scent filling his lungs with an odd sense of familiarity. The creature responded by withdrawing slightly, its mist form becoming more unstable. Henry saw this as an opportunity. Moving quickly, he swung his heavy toolkit, the metal box crashing through the mist being's form. The vapor dispersed, but only for a moment, and then it quickly reformed. The creature seemed to regroup, but Henry was already on the move, backing away slowly, trying to get to the engineering section where he could barricade himself and think. His heart was still pounding, but it wasn't fear. It was something else, something closer to excitement. There was a rush, a spark of adrenaline that he hadn't felt in years. "All right," Henry whispered to himself, half amused. "You're a strange one, aren't you?" He reached the engineering bay and slammed the door shut behind him. The strange being wasn't far behind, and Henry knew it. He didn't have much time. His mind raced through possibilities, each one more bizarre than the last. Was this a hallucination? No. The emergency power fluctuations and the malfunctioning AI were real. This wasn't a trick. He wasn't imagining it. The most obvious explanation, the one Henry hadn't even considered at first, was that these creatures weren't from around here. This was something alien, something truly out of this world. And whatever it was, it had just made its first mistake. It had underestimated Henry Tanner. Henry pulled up the station's systems, his fingers flying over the console as he searched for any kind of defense system. There was nothing that would work against what he was facing. The rig was a mining station, not a military ship, and it had no weapons capable of dealing with the kind of enemy he was now up against. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair, trying to calm himself. Anxiety had been his constant companion, for as long as he could remember. It had crippled him, shaped him, but now in the face of something truly terrifying, it seemed to do something else. It fueled him. Whatever these creatures were, they had made a fatal error by bringing their fear gas into his space. Henry wasn't like the others they had encountered. He wasn't afraid of the unknown. He had lived with fear every day of his life. And now it seemed that fear was his greatest weapon. Alien intentions. The hum of the rig's failing systems was the only sound in the darkened engineering bay. Henry sat hunched over the terminal, eyes glued to the flashing alerts on the screen. His fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, but his mind was elsewhere, racing, calculating, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had faced down the mist being, but there were still more questions than answers. Why had it come? Why had it chosen him to approach? And why had it recoiled when its fear toxin had no effect? Henry ran a hand through his disheveled hair and let out a frustrated sigh. The room felt colder, the silence heavier, as though the entire rig was holding its breath. A vague sense of foreboding lingered in the air, and Henry couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The momentary victory over the alien vapor creature seemed almost trivial now. He needed to know more. The control terminal in front of him flickered with a series of system diagnostics, but Henry's focus was entirely elsewhere. There were no answers here, at least not the kind he needed. He needed to know what he was dealing with. He needed to understand what had just attacked him, what its purpose was, and what came next. He had never believed in extraterrestrial life until now. But everything that had happened in the last few hours had shattered that disbelief completely. He rubbed his eyes, his exhaustion starting to catch up with him. It had been days since he'd last had a proper rest. The crew quarters were a few doors down, but he couldn't afford to sleep now. Not with so much at stake. No, Henry needed to act, and he needed to act fast. Henry turned to the communication panel, his fingers hovering above the keys. The AI was still dormant, its usual cheery voice conspicuously absent. He thought about the rest of the crew. Were they in danger too? Had they encountered the mist beings? The emptiness of the crew, quarters earlier, had been unsettling. No signs of a struggle, no blood, just a strange, eerie silence. That was something he hadn't mentioned yet, and something that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. His hand clenched into a fist, and he slammed it against the side of the desk in frustration. The moment he'd encountered that mist being, the calm that washed over him hadn't been fear. It had been the opposite, familiarity. The smell of petroleum, sulfur, and refinery emissions had triggered something in his brain, a chemical reaction that had allowed him to remain immune to the effects of the alien's fear toxin. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how bizarre it was that the mist had no effect on him. There had been no fear, no paralysis, no overwhelming terror. Was it possible that the aliens weren't just harvesting fear? Could there have been something else they were after? He couldn't shake the feeling that they were studying him, trying to figure out why their fear toxin had failed on him. "Let's see what you're really after," Henry muttered to himself. He pushed his chair back and stood, grabbing his toolkit once again. It wasn't a good idea to leave anything to chance. He needed to get to the communications hub and figure out just what the hell was going on. The journey to the communications hub was uneventful, though the silence in the rig was deafening. Every step Henry took seemed to echo louder than the last, a stark reminder of the eerie stillness of the station. The mist from earlier hadn't reappeared, but he had a feeling it wasn't gone for good. It was only a matter of time before it came back. The question now was, what was it waiting for? What was the alien force's goal? As he approached the communications hub, Henry noticed that the door was slightly ajar, an odd sight considering how secure the rig was meant to be. He pulled the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the hub was dimly lit just like the rest of the station, but it didn't feel right. The air inside was thick, charged, and Henry could taste the metallic tang of something foul in the back of his throat. He didn't waste time. His eyes scanned the room quickly, focusing on the terminal at the far end. The blinking lights of the communication panel were like a beacon, drawing him in. He stepped forward, but something stopped him. A faint, almost imperceptible hum filled the room. It was different from the normal noise of the rig. It was deeper, more resonant, unnatural. Suddenly, he saw it. A screen flickered to life, displaying a series of cryptic symbols and star maps. Henry's heart skipped a beat. The maps were unlike anything he had seen in human databases. This wasn't just a navigation system. This was a map of human worlds, and it was focusing on major population centers. Earth was one of the most prominent dots, marked with a red flashing symbol. Henry leaned closer, his heart pounding in his chest. These aliens weren't here by accident. He quickly ran through the system logs, his fingers flying over the terminal's keypad. The messages that scrolled past his eyes were disturbing. The transmission logs showed bursts of data sent out from the rig, but it wasn't anything he recognized. The format was completely alien, foreign to human technology. There were no words, just strange sequences and symbols, but the visual components of the data made one thing perfectly clear. Earth was the target. The final transmission was the most chilling. It was a message that had been sent from the rig's own communication systems, but it was in a language Henry didn't understand. As he scrolled further, he found images, star maps again, but this time, the maps zoomed in on Earth with incredible detail. There were no errors, no mistakes in the data. Every major city on Earth was clearly marked, and the timing of the transmission was undeniable. The aliens were on their way. Henry's stomach dropped. The rig wasn't just a mining station. It was a staging ground. The aliens were using it as a base of operations, and from what he could tell, their mission was far more sinister than a simple reconnaissance. The planet was in danger. Before he could react, a sharp sound broke through the silence of the hub. It was faint at first, like a soft, distant whisper, but it grew louder, sharper, more persistent. Henry's pulse quickened. The sound was coming from behind him, growing nearer, and he could feel the air around him thicken again. The mist was The door slammed shut, cutting off his escape. The dim lights of the hub flickered once, twice, then went completely dark. Panic surged through him. The hum in the air was louder now, vibrating through his bones. With his back against the wall, Henry reached for his toolkit and quickly began looking for a way out. But as the darkness settled around him, he realized that there was no running from this. No more hiding. He was at the center of an alien invasion, and if he didn't act now, Earth would fall before it even had a chance to defend itself. All right, he whispered to himself, a fire igniting in his chest. Time to show them what humanity can do. The fight for survival, Henry's mind was racing as he leaned against the dimly lit control panel, his fingers furiously working through the emergency systems. The air in the communications hub felt heavier now, thick with the lingering presence of the alien mist. It had returned, swirling through the room with an eerie purpose. He could hear the faint hiss of the vapor creeping through the vents, but he didn't dare turn his head. Turning would mean showing weakness, and Henry Tanner was no stranger to pushing through the hardest moments, even when the odds were stacked against him. The thought of the crew haunted him. Were they still alive? Had the aliens already harvested their fear, leaving their bodies lifeless, drained of everything? The footage he had seen earlier, showing the crew peacefully sleeping and then being engulfed by the mist, sent a chill down his spine. His hand clenched around the edge of the console. He needed to act, and fast. There were no signs of life on the comms panel, only encrypted data transmissions from the rig's internal systems. Whatever had attacked them, it wasn't some simple escape attempt or a mechanical failure. This was intentional, and whatever the aliens were doing, it was designed for one purpose: to feed. Suddenly, a crash from behind him broke the silence. His heart skipped a beat as he spun around, instinctively reaching for the flamethrower he had rigged together earlier. The mist had materialized once again, but this time it wasn't just one being. No, now there were several. Henry's mind worked in overdrive. There was no time to waste. He needed to get to the escape pods, the only route to safety for the rest of the crew. But how could he fight back against an enemy that could manipulate its form at will? The flamethrower might stop them temporarily, but it wouldn't be enough to get him out of the rig alive. He needed something more. His training had never covered this. No space mining course taught you how to fight creatures that defied the very laws of physics. Yet here he was, in the heart of a battle for survival against beings capable of manipulating fear itself. These aliens, with their ability to create a sense of dread in their victims, had underestimated one thing: humans. They had underestimated him. As the mist beings closed in, Henry could feel the weight of their presence, their very existence pressing against him like a storm on the horizon. The air was thick, and the familiar chemical stench grew stronger. His mind flashed back to his father's refinery explosion, to the years of anxiety that followed, to the countless sleepless nights spent battling his own mind. All of those moments, all of that fear had prepared him for this, for the unknown, for the terror of space and everything it held. "You're going to regret this," Henry muttered under his breath. The mist beings swirled closer, but Henry didn't flinch. He steadied his hand, keeping his flamethrower aimed at the largest of the creatures, a towering form that seemed to pulse with an ominous energy. Without warning, the creature lunged forward, releasing another burst of green vapor directly at him. Henry inhaled deeply, his chest tightening in anticipation, but this time it was different. The usual wave of anxiety didn't hit him. Instead, something cold, something primal, surged through his veins. It wasn't fear. It was something else entirely. His mind wasn't clouded. It was sharp. And in that moment, the alien's fear toxin worked against it. It couldn't control him. He took a step forward, moving toward the mist with calculated precision. As the vapor reached him, he exhaled, the tension leaving his body. The green mist had no effect on him. It was just another chemical, another concoction trying to break him. Henry moved quickly, swinging his makeshift flamethrower toward the creature. The fire erupted from the nozzle, and the alien screeched as the flames engulfed it. But the mist was resilient. The creature began to shift, reforming itself as the fire licked at its form, the mist being becoming more unstable. It had clearly not expected this. It had expected fear, but it hadn't counted on Henry's resistance. Another alien rushed forward, but Henry was faster. With a quick motion, he aimed the flamethrower once again, blasting the creature back. It screeched, its form flickering and distorting under the heat. But Henry didn't stop. He kept firing, each burst of flame pushing the mist beings further and further back. Their forms were dissipating in the heat, but it was a temporary solution. He needed more. He needed to reach the escape pods before the creatures overran him. Henry backed toward the door, still firing the flamethrower as he went. The mist was becoming more aggressive, swirling with greater intensity, and Henry could hear the low hum of their energy building around him. Whatever they were planning, it wasn't just to subdue him. They wanted to break him, to feed on his fear. But he had no fear left to give. His constant battle with his own anxiety had prepared him for this moment in ways that nothing else could. He reached the door to the escape pod bay, his chest heaving with effort, his breathing erratic. His pulse was still racing, but there was no panic, no rising tide of terror. Only calm, only determination. Henry knew what he had to do. As he entered the pod bay, he found the worst possible sight. Of the 4 escape pods, 1 was already gone. The advance team, whoever they were, had already left. The other 2 had been deliberately sabotaged. The only remaining pod was being guarded by a group of mist beings. They were waiting for him. Henry's instincts kicked in. He had no time to waste. He had to act now or all would be lost. Without hesitation, Henry took the flamethrower in both hands and leveled it at the group of creatures. They had surrounded the pod, their misty forms swirling ominously. He had no choice but to fight his way through. His mind raced through the options. Direct confrontation wasn't an option. There were too many of them. He needed a distraction, something to scatter them, something that would give him a chance to get to the pod. As he scanned the room, his eyes landed on the fire suppression system. The large tanks were located near the walls. A fire suppression network designed to keep the rig from burning down in case of emergency. Henry knew exactly what he had to do. He rushed toward the tanks, pulling at the release valves and triggering the system. Foam and water sprayed from the ceiling nozzles, filling the space with a blinding white fog. The mist beings shrieked, disoriented by the chaos. This was his moment. Henry sprinted toward the escape pod, firing his flamethrower as he went, pushing through the disoriented beings. The fire cut through the mist like a blade, scattering the creatures as they backed away. He didn't stop. His fingers found the pod's control panel, and with a series of quick presses, he activated the door. The pod's hatch opened with a hiss. Henry dove inside, and just as the door closed behind him, he saw the mist beings regrouping. They were already preparing for another assault, but it was too late. Henry had won. As the escape pod's engines roared to life, the pod detached from the rig with a jolt, sending Henry hurtling into the void of space. He looked back at the mining rig, now growing smaller in the distance. The mist beings could follow, but they wouldn't catch him. The battle wasn't over. But Henry had won. The first round. The escape plan. Henry's hands gripped the control panel of the escape pod, knuckles turning white under the pressure. He stared out of the viewport, watching as the mining rig, once his home, drifted farther into the blackness of space. The familiar hum of the pod's engine was now a comforting sound, and yet a strange unease gnawed at his stomach. He was safe for now, but not for long. The mist beings, the alien creatures, hadn't given up. They were still out there, their presence lingering in the void like an unseen predator. As much as he wanted to breathe a sigh of relief, Henry knew the truth. This wasn't over. The rig's destruction wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Henry's mind raced with possibilities. What had they wanted? Why Earth? He had seen the maps, the marked cities. Earth was their destination, and it wasn't just a random choice. They were targeting humanity, harvesting fear like some kind of sick galactic delicacy. It made his blood run cold just thinking about it. The mist beings had left the mining rig in ruin, and now they were on their way to Earth. Henry's only hope now was to reach them before they reached his home planet. The escape pod's internal systems were functional, but barely. The pod wasn't built for long-distance travel, and Henry knew the fuel reserves wouldn't last forever. He had to make it to the alien mothership before the pod ran out of power, and he had to do it quickly. The creatures had an advantage: intelligence, speed, and the ability to manipulate fear. But Henry had something they didn't: sheer human willpower. The anxiety that had tormented him for years had finally become his greatest asset, allowing him to withstand their fear toxin and think clearly when others might have fallen into panic. "All right, Tanner," he muttered to himself as he double-checked the pod systems. "Let's see if we can make it through this." His hands worked expertly, setting a course for the alien mothership. It had been easy enough to locate. The ship was massive, pulsating with a strange energy that Henry could feel even from this distance. The sensors on the pod's dashboard blinked red, confirming what he already knew. The ship was heading straight for Earth, and it wouldn't take long to get there. The countdown to their inevitable arrival was already ticking in his mind, each passing second pulling them closer to the unknown. The thought of Earth, so close yet so far, made his heart race. He thought about the people he'd left behind, the crew who were now lost to the aliens, and the countless civilians who would be unprepared for the horrors to come. But then he thought about his own survival. The creatures had already made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated him. They had used their fear gas, expecting it to break him, to make him succumb to terror. What they hadn't realized was that Henry had lived with that terror for years. His anxiety had been his constant companion, but now it was a tool, a weapon against their fear toxin. If anyone was going to stop them, it was him. He glanced at the screen again. The alien mothership loomed large in the distance now, an ominous presence that seemed to suck the light out of space around it. The closer he got, the more Henry could feel its pull, like a gravity well drawing him in, making everything around him feel smaller, more insignificant. His palms grew sweaty, but he didn't back down. He couldn't. Not now. Not when Earth's fate rested in his hands. The pod was already showing signs of strain. The engines sputtered, and the power reserves dipped lower with each passing minute. Henry knew it wouldn't be long before he was out of options, but he couldn't afford to think about failure. His only choice now was to keep moving forward. As he maneuvered the pod closer to the mothership, his mind flashed to the next step. He needed to find a way inside. The ship was unlike anything humanity had ever seen. Vast, cloud-like, organic, and pulsating with energy. There were no docking ports or airlocks, no obvious entry points. The alien vessel didn't operate on any logic he understood. But that didn't matter. Henry had dealt with impossible odds before. If there was a way in, he would find it. The first hint came when the pod scanners detected a weak point on the outer edge of the mothership. It wasn't much, a small breach in the structure, barely noticeable against the ship's otherwise impenetrable surface. But to Henry, it was everything. He adjusted the pod's trajectory, aligning it with the opening. The pod shuddered as the overtaxed engines pushed through the last few kilometers, the distance between him and the ship narrowing with every breath. The pod's warning lights flashed red, signaling imminent system failure. But Henry didn't stop. With a deep breath, he braced himself. "Here goes nothing," he muttered. The pod lurched forward, and Henry triggered the mining laser, the only tool at his disposal capable of cutting through the alien ship's outer membrane. The beam struck the ship's surface, and to Henry's surprise, it cut through much easier than he expected. There was no explosive decompression, no violent rupture. Instead, the ship's membrane seemed to react like flesh, curling inward at the point of impact, as if in pain. The hole was small but enough to allow him entry. The pod's engines sputtered, and Henry could feel the tension in his chest rise. The escape pod was barely holding together, and he was venturing into a ship that defied all logic. But this was his only shot. He couldn't turn back now. As the pod's exterior breached the alien ship's hull, Henry powered down the engines, allowing the pod to drift inside. He had no idea what to expect next. Was the ship alive? Would it attack him the moment he entered. But Henry wasn't thinking about the what-ifs. He was thinking about the plan. His mind had already shifted into survival mode. There was no room for fear now, only action. Inside the alien ship, the environment was unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls of the ship weren't metal but organic, alive in a way that seemed almost unnatural. The air was thick with the same chemical smell Henry had inhaled earlier, and the atmosphere felt dense as if it were pressing down on him. He felt lightheaded at first, but the feeling passed quickly. His mind had become accustomed to this strange environment, the scent of fear-laced chemicals oddly familiar now. Henry stepped out of the pod, his boots making soft thuds against the alien floor. The moment his feet touched the ground, he knew this was it. This was where the real fight began. But as he ventured deeper into the ship, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The mist beings, those who had attacked him, were still out there, somewhere in the labyrinthine corridors of the alien vessel. But Henry wasn't afraid anymore. The fear toxin they relied on had failed, and now it was his turn to show them what humanity was capable of. He moved deeper into the ship, making his way toward the core, the central point where the collective consciousness of the aliens resided. The final confrontation was drawing closer, and Henry Tanner wasn't about to let the aliens win. The journey to the Nexus, Henry's boots made no sound as he moved through the alien ship, the eerie silence of the vessel amplifying every small shift in his movements. The walls were not metal or stone, but some organic material that seemed to pulse and shift with an unnatural rhythm, as if the ship itself was alive. He could feel the subtle vibrations in the air, the hum of energy moving through the ship's structure like a heartbeat. Each step felt like it took him deeper into the heart of the unknown, into a place where no human had ever ventured before. His mind was sharp, his senses heightened. The fear gas had failed to affect him, and now he was determined to use that to his advantage. He wasn't sure what the aliens wanted, but the star maps had made it clear. They had Earth in their sights. And now he had to stop them. Henry adjusted his suit, its seals and life support systems working flawlessly, keeping the ship's atmosphere out of his lungs. The thick, almost syrupy air felt foreign, like it didn't belong here. Something that didn't belong anywhere. The chemical smell, the same as before, hung heavy in the air, but it didn't faze him anymore. To him, it was just another oddity in this alien world. As he moved deeper into the ship, the corridors twisted and curved unnaturally. There were no clear directions, no indicators telling him which way to go. The ship seemed to defy human logic, its layout like a living maze designed to confuse, to disorient, to lead its intruders astray. But Henry had one advantage: his engineering mind. He could read systems, he could decipher patterns, and he could think his way through this ship. He knew it wasn't just a ship, it was a weapon, an extension of a collective consciousness, an entity that had been feeding on fear across countless worlds, but not on him. The deeper he went, the more disorienting the environment became. The walls seemed to bend and shift like they were alive, stretching and pulsating with every beat. The entire ship felt as though it was breathing, and Henry couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The mist beings were out there moving through the ship hunting. But they weren't hunting for him, they were hunting for fear, and they weren't going to find any in him. Henry's pulse quickened as he heard a sound. It wasn't the usual hum of the ship or the echo of his footsteps. It was the low, throaty hiss of mist beings closing in on him. He didn't panic. His mind immediately went to his flamethrower. He pulled it from its holster, checking the fuel level. It was low. He wouldn't have many more shots before it ran dry. But there was no turning back now. The mist beings materialized in front of him, moving as fluidly as smoke, their forms coiling and uncoiling with unnatural grace. Their presence filled the room, and Henry could feel the air around him growing heavier, thick with the oppressive energy of their fear toxin. He inhaled deeply, the familiar chemical smell filling his nostrils, but it didn't affect him. It was like breathing air. He was used to it now. They moved toward him slowly, deliberately, as though they knew they had him cornered. They released another burst of green vapor, but Henry didn't flinch. The flamethrower ignited in his hand, and with one swift motion, He fired a burst of fire at the nearest mist being. The flame cut through the vapor, sending the creature screeching backward as it recoiled from the heat. The others hesitated, their forms flickering, but they didn't retreat. "Is that all you've got?" Henry muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He fired again, this time with more precision, aiming for the creature's thickest clusters of vapor. The mist beings dispersed, but not enough. They didn't seem to learn. They only advanced, pushing forward with greater determination. But Henry wasn't about to let them win. As the fire licked at the mist, Henry moved quickly, forcing his way through the growing cloud. The flamethrower sputtered, its flame growing weaker, but he kept going. He didn't have time to waste. He had a job to do. The next few minutes were a blur of smoke, fire, and shifting forms. He was running on instinct now, moving faster than he thought possible through the dark, twisting corridors of the alien vessel. His breath came in sharp, controlled bursts, his pulse pounding in his ears. The mist was everywhere, flowing around him, encircling him. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of fighting through the mist and using every scrap of ingenuity he had, Henry reached what he was looking for. It was a massive, pulsating chamber, more like a cavern than a room, its walls glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. The air was thick here, swirling with the same mist that had followed him through the ship. But in the center of the room was something far more important: the Nexus. The Nexus was the heart of the alien ship, the source of its power. Henry could feel the presence of the collective consciousness of the mist beings, their minds connected, in a web, linked to the Nexus like the threads of a spider's web. It was here that they fed, here that they drew their power, and it was here that Henry had to stop them. He moved closer, taking slow, deliberate steps as he approached the glowing core of the ship. The Nexus was alive. Its energy thrummed in, the air vibrating through Henry's bones. It was a vast organic structure the size of a small building, but with no clear boundaries. The walls around it seemed to shift and change, the very fabric of reality bending in its presence. He could feel the ship's consciousness pushing against his mind, trying to connect with him, to invade his thoughts. But Henry wasn't like the others. He had learned to fight his own demons, his own fears, and now he was going to use that to fight this. Henry reached into his toolkit and pulled out a small device, a diagnostic tool designed to interface with alien systems. He wasn't sure it would work, but it was the only option he had. He attached the device to the surface of the Nexus and began to run a scan. The device lit up with a series of symbols and patterns, and Henry's heart raced. He was getting somewhere. But as the scan continued, the mist beings closed in around him. They were drawn to the Nexus, to the source of their power, and they would stop at nothing to defend it. The pressure in the air thickened, and the first tendril of green mist reached out toward Henry, wrapping around him like a noose. His heart pounded harder, his breath catching in his throat. "Not today," he whispered, gritting his teeth. His hands flew to the flamethrower again, but this time, he didn't use it to fight. He used it to buy himself time. The fire flared, burning the mist back, allowing Henry to keep working. He felt the tension build as the scan completed, the device clicking into place with a soft, final beep. He had found it, the weakness. The Nexus wasn't just a power source, it was the key to their collective consciousness. Disrupting it would sever their link, scatter them, and render the ship helpless. Henry took a deep breath. It was time. The final stand, Henry's fingers trembled slightly as he stood in front of the Nexus, the heart of the alien ship. The eerie, organic glow of the massive core pulsed in time with his heartbeat, the light casting shifting shadows across the walls. The air around him vibrated with an energy that felt both alive and malevolent, as if the ship itself was aware of his presence, waiting to strike. He could feel the mist beings gathering around him, their forms flickering in and out of existence, like smoke, their collective consciousness pressing against his mind, trying to force its way in. But Henry wasn't like the others. He had spent his life battling the demons of his own mind, the constant undercurrent of anxiety that had plagued him since he was a child. The aliens had tried to use fear as a weapon, but it had failed. They had underestimated him, just as so many people had done before. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. His palms were sweaty, but his mind was clear. This wasn't just about survival anymore, this was about protecting Earth. About stopping the aliens from feeding on the fear of an entire planet, reducing humanity to nothing but a resource to be harvested. He turned his gaze to the device he had attached to the Nexus earlier, the diagnostic tool that had revealed its secret. The data had shown him a way to sever the connection between the Nexus and the collective consciousness of the mist beings. He had the power to destroy it, to break their link, but it would require a level of precision and focus that he wasn't sure he could manage. He wasn't sure if the ship would even allow him to succeed. The mist beings began to converge on him, their forms coiling and undulating like a living cloud of smoke. They were closing in, faster now, their swirling tendrils, reaching out to ensnare him. The overwhelming pressure in the air grew heavier, like an invisible weight pressing against his chest. Henry felt the familiar tightness return to his lungs. It was the anxiety, creeping back into his system. But this time, it wasn't going to control him. Not now. Not when he had the chance to stop them all. The mist beings released another burst of their fear gas. The green vapor swirling toward him like a deadly cloud. This time it was different. The gas was thick, heavier, and the pressure it exerted was stronger. It was a direct assault on his mind. A flood of images and emotions meant to break him, to overwhelm him with fear. His father's death, the explosion at the refinery, the endless years of panic and anxiety that had followed, the faces of the people he had lost, his ex-wives, the friends he had never made. Henry's breath quickened, his chest tightening painfully. But then, something clicked in his mind. It was like a switch had been flipped. All of a sudden, the fear wasn't controlling him. It was just a part of him, like it always had been. He didn't need to fight it anymore. He had spent his whole life learning to live with it, to coexist with it, and now it was his strength. Not today, Henry whispered through gritted teeth. With a calmness he didn't fully understand, he stepped forward, his hand reaching for the device that would sever the Nexus's connection to the mist beings. He knew that this was it. There was no turning back. If he succeeded, the ship would crumble. The mist beings would be cut off from their collective consciousness, and they would be scattered, unable to function as a unit. But if he failed, if the device malfunctioned or if the ship fought back, there would be no escape. Earth would fall. Humanity would fall. As his hand touched the device, the mist beings recoiled. It was as though they sensed what he was doing. Their forms writhed in agitation, the air around them crackling with energy. Henry's fingers hovered over the final control, feeling the heat of the moment burn in his chest. He could feel the fear building again, but this time he welcomed it. He wasn't afraid of the fear. He wasn't afraid of anything anymore. He had faced the worst of his own mind and had come out the other side stronger. With a steady hand, Henry pressed the final button. The reaction was immediate. The Nexus shuddered, its glow flashing brighter, then dimming. The walls of the ship groaned as if in pain. A low, vibrating hum filled the air, a sound that seemed to ripple through the entire ship. Henry staggered back, his vision blurring, as the force of the ship's reaction sent a shock wave through the chamber. The mist beings screamed, their forms dissolving and reforming, their collective consciousness cracking like glass under the weight of Henry's decision. The walls around him began to pulse erratically, the once smooth surface of the ship warping, stretching. It was as though the ship itself was dying, its heartbeat slowing, its life force fading. The energy that had once flowed through the Nexus was now in chaos. The connection between the mist beings severed. The collective consciousness splintered, and with it the mist beings lost their power. But Henry didn't stop. The ship was falling apart, and he knew he had mere seconds before it collapsed completely. He turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest. The walls of the ship were cracking, the once organic material breaking apart like brittle stone. The sound of the Nexus's collapse echoed in the distance, and Henry could feel the ship beginning to implode. He didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. His mind was focused on one thing: getting to the escape pod. He had to get to the pod and get back to Earth. He had to warn humanity. He had to make sure this never happened again. As he sprinted through the collapsing corridors, the ship groaning and creaking around him, Henry's breath came in ragged gasps. The fear gas was gone, but the adrenaline was coursing through his veins now. The ship's walls were closing in, the ceiling cracking and falling away in chunks. But Henry kept running, the sound of his footsteps the only thing he could hear above the chaos. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the breach in the ship's hull. The escape pod was waiting, its hatch open, ready for him to climb inside. The mist beings were gone, their influence destroyed. The alien mothership was crumbling, its pulse fading into nothing. Henry didn't hesitate. He dove into the pod, slamming the hatch shut behind him. The pod's engines roared to life, and Henry watched as the alien ship exploded in a brilliant flash of light behind him. The escape pod shot through the void of space, its systems barely holding together as it left the collapsing mothership behind. As Henry steadied the controls, he could see Earth growing larger in the distance, a familiar blue and green planet that felt so impossibly far away just hours ago. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The mission was over. The battle was won, and Henry Tanner, the man who had spent his life fighting his own fears, had just saved humanity.